Hello, and welcome to another creative photography tutorial from Creative Photo Folk. If you're new to these parts, I'm Hayley, and today I'm showing you how to turn photos of buildings into collectible fine art using Photoshop. Now, I was lucky enough to have some photos of buildings that I'd shot on my travels to experiment with. And I wanted to do this just to see how kind of forgiving this technique was. I didn't want to have to make any special effort. I just wanted to see how easy this was to do. And I'm really quite impressed with the results, so I didn't feel the need to go and shoot more. However, if photographing architecture is new for you, here's how I suggest going about it. So head into a city centre and take along a wideish lens such as a 24-70. You ideally want a day that has flat lighting for this technique, so wait for an overcast day with plenty of clouds or head in towards dusk as the sun is going down. To shoot, you can either expose for the sky so that the buildings kind of fall into darkness, or if you want to capture cool streaky clouds in the shot, you can use a long exposure of say 20 seconds. But if you find that this is overexposing, then you might need a neutral density filter to help cut the light reaching the lens, and this gives you the ability to create longer exposures. However, this step is not necessary, as I just edited in new clouds in Photoshop and then blurred them for the streaky effect, so you can get around this if you are okay with not getting everything right in camera. Which, considering this technique, there's a good chance you're not that fussed. Now, we're going to start our editing process in Lightroom by affecting the shadows and highlights and making any lens corrections if necessary. So this is what my original straight out of camera image looked like, and this is it after we've done some work in Lightroom. So let's talk through what we've done. So basically, I have just adjusted the exposure up a tiny bit and brought up a tiny bit of contrast. Highlights I've taken right down to 0, and shadows I've taken pretty much all the way up. I've boosted my whites a touch and brought down my blacks a tiny bit, given it a touch more clarity just to make the details pop. Brought up a little vibrance, which probably wasn't necessary in this case. And I don't believe I've done too much else in here. One thing you could do is bring down the luminance in your HSL sliders of the blues, and that will affect your sky. I won't do that in this instance, but you might find it helpful. I have done a touch of sharpening, and normally I would mask that away from the details, so there we go. Lens correction, I have fixed the chromatic aberration and profile correction, so as you can see, that just stretches that out a bit more, which creates a bit more symmetry. That's pretty much it. So then I brought that across into Photoshop by going to Photo, Edit in Adobe Photoshop, and now we have the image here. So the first thing I will do is it's come in as a background layer, so I'm just going to click the lock to unlock that so we can work with it. And I'll just make a copy with Control or Command J, just so we've got that as a reference. I'm even just going to switch it off so I know that it's not a layer that we're working with. So what we want to work on now is getting rid of any distractions. So in this case, we've got a little man here. I think that's a person there, a bin, and then this bollard that's getting in the way. So I'm going to take a look at fixing those issues. Now, at the time of recording, generative fill has been a feature in Photoshop for a couple of months now. So I'm going to work with these newer tools. And the first one we'll take a look at, which has now gone out of beta and into the main Photoshop, is the Remove tool. So the Remove tool is found with your other healing tools, which is under this little band-aid here. If you click and hold it, you'll be able to access your tools. And at the moment, we've got the healing brush tool loaded, and we actually want the Remove tool. So I'll just click that one. And the Remove tool is destructive. So if I do things to this image now, I won't be able to kind of go back and change it later on. So instead, I'm going to make a copy of our layer again with Control Command J. I'm just going to call this one our base layer just by double clicking it and changing the name. And I'll call this one Remove Tool. And the first thing we'll try and do is remove this person here. So I'm just going to switch to my zoom tool with Z, zoom in, and I'll make my brush about the size of the person I want to remove. And then I will just paint over him, and Photoshop will have a think and do its best to remove him. Let's have a look at before and after. Now, I'm not in love with that because it has changed the color of the little poles. So I'm going to leave him for now and we'll work on something else. Perhaps we'll work on this bollard now. So again, I will make the brush about the size I want and then paint over it. Let's see. It's done a pretty good job of most things. I could live with kind of what's going on here. I'm not really loving what's going on here though. I mean, the truth is no one would probably notice, but I would. So in this instance, the remove tool maybe isn't the one for us. So perhaps we should take a look at the new generative fill feature. So again, I'm just going to make a copy of my layer. We'll call this Gen Fill for comparison. So to access it, you first need to make a selection. So I'm just going to load my lasso tool, which with L, the shortcut L, and draw around this bollard pretty roughly. And then I will hit generative fill. I'm not going to type anything in this box because I just want it to take a read of the scene. We'll hit generate and see what happens. Let's zoom in and take a look. Not bad at all, really. It has made a mess of this, but I always suspected it would. We've got another method to fix that later on. Now, if I really wanted to get specific here, I would probably paint away a few little features, like the top of that doesn't actually line up. And it looks like it's taken one of these and made it really big. So I'd probably clone that out. Let's look at the other. Oh, I like that one. Yes, see, that has saved us even fixing anything because compared to that first one, it does a really good job. So let's run with that. Now, I will now try doing this little man here. Now, in the past, before generative fill existed, you would have had to manually clone all this. And for an image like this, that would be pretty much a nightmare because getting these poles to line up is quite difficult. I have had a go at it. So generative fill, as controversial as AI is so great in situations like this, saving you hours of work. Absolutely beautiful. Now let's do this section. Fantastic. And finally, we have the bin. And I just noticed this little, I don't know, cart or something in the side that I actually haven't noticed before. So we'll do that while we're here. And as you'll see over on the right, the generative fill is creating a layer for each fix we do, which is great because if we need to go back and fix one, we have the option. Isn't that wonderful and so quick? Now, just for comparison's sake, because I don't know what's going to happen with generative fill in the future, I'm going to turn all those off and maybe have a go at just actually trying to clone something as we would have had to do in the olden days. So I'm going to create a new layer and then I would go for my clone tool, which is the S is the shortcut and it looks like this little stamp here. I would make it a bit bigger and I would sample by holding down Alt or Option and you'll see that the cursor changes. And I would say, please sample from this section here. And then I would come over and you can see the little sample and draw in a relatively similar action. And you can see it's a little bit high. So now that I've painted it in, I would go back to my move tool and with the keys on my keyboard, I will just move that down into place. And then I would add a layer mask using a brush with black loaded. So B is for my brush and I've got black loaded. I can just paint black on the layer mask to get rid of that. So that worked okay. I would also just see it's cloned that thing. So work on that. So that is an option and that didn't take terribly long. But you will see that generative fill is a bit quicker and this section would be a bit more of a pain because obviously you'd be cloning that section and then this section and that probably wouldn't line up particularly well and then all the ground. But anyway, so now you know the alternative. And what I'm really aiming for here with this particular building is getting everything symmetrical because it is a symmetrical building. So anything that isn't symmetrical will grab the eye. In that case, we've still got this little guy here. So to fix it, what I'm actually going to do is go back to my base layer, make a copy of that base layer, again with Control or Command J, and we'll go to Edit, Transform, Flip Horizontal. Then I'm going to drag this layer to the top of everything we've done. I'm going to add a layer mask to it. And I'm going to press Control or Command I to make that layer invisible. So now it's filled with black, meaning the layer is invisible. And what I want to do is load my brush tool, then making sure that white is loaded on my swatch. All I'm going to do is paint over that little guy. And so now what we've got is this one just copied to this side. So now if we zoom in, we can take a look and that looks good. The next thing I would work on for this image is removing these buildings. Now, I tried doing this with the clone tool and it took me ages. So in the end, what I actually ended up doing was just replacing the sky. And I recommend that for this technique anyway. So to bring in a new sky, we just open it the same way that we did with the original image, and then we can just drag the sky into this layer. So this is a different sky, but just to show you how I would do it, you could drag it up from its file and down and into the new file, pop it into place, and then you would mask it in. But I'll show you that process on the original sky I used. So let's just undo that. And so this is what the final image will look like, just to give you a little preview. But I'm only in this file just to grab that sky. So this is what the sky I chose looked like. Now I'm just going to drag it down under everything we've done already, under our base layer. And then what we'll need to do is make a selection of the building so that we can then put the sky in the background. So currently the way I'm going to try and do that is using the object selection tool, which is found under the fourth icon here. The shortcut is W. And if you hold that down, it's the top one in that list. So with the object selection tool, I can just drag it over subjects in the image and it will turn pink when it locates a subject. So I will just click once to say, yes, I would like this to be selected. And then Photoshop will do its thing and create the selection for us. Usually the pink thing disappears. Actually, that's pretty good, but it hasn't got the ground. So what I will now do is hold down Shift to tell Photoshop that I want to add to the selection we already have. And then I'm going to draw roughly around the areas that I want to include. Hopefully it's not going to grab those buildings in the background, and see how it copes with that. I got the ground, it just didn't get the grass. So we'll try that again, holding down Shift, dragging around the grass. So then I can add a layer mask to this layer, and we have a new sky, and our distracting buildings in the background are gone. Now, I won't do this yet, but if you wanted to move your sky around, you could highlight your sky layer and just sort of move it into position. You could make it bigger or smaller, but I'll keep it where it was for now. So the next thing we need to do is make our image black and white to work with this technique. So we'll go back up to the very top of our layer stack, and I'll add a black and white adjustment layer. So our adjustment layers are found under the little black and white pie. We will go to black and white. Now, there are lots of ways to convert to black and white in Photoshop, and I go over many of these ways inside my courses, but for this technique, I've found that a simple black and white adjustment layer works best, and then we can start to play with the sliders to see what effects we can get. So I can make that grass brighter or darker. Really bring down that sky, which I did have in the original. Really adds a lot of drama. And that's really what we're looking to achieve, is to add more contrast and drama. Now this has got me some ways to where I want to go, but now I want to add a level. So again, that's just found under the adjustment layer icon. Go to levels, and we can pull in these sliders to make it even more dramatic. So that raises the highlights. This raises the shadows, and then we can play with the midtones to taste. I'll go with something like that for now. Now it's really down to personal taste as to what you do next. So my best tip is to take a moment to really think about where you want the light hitting your building from and what that would look like in reality. So in my case, I think I want to add more of a splash of light to the center that gradually tapers off around the edges, just like it would in reality. I also think the ground is a little bright, so I might darken that down so it's not so distracting, and perhaps do a little more work to the sky. So to be able to achieve this sculpting of light, you may need to selectively affect different parts of the image. And we do that by selecting the different elements of the building separately and then affecting them individually. So there are many, many ways to make selections in Photoshop, and I go very deeply into this inside my Editing Essentials course. But the four main ways are the lasso tool, select subject, object selection, which I've shown you already, and then the pen tool. So I'll just quickly demonstrate what these look like. And this is where this technique isn't difficult to do, but it does become a bit time-consuming to make very accurate selections. So as I said, I'm finding this ground a bit distracting, so let's make a selection of it. So the first thing I would do in this instance is try that object selection tool again. So in this case, we'll go to object selection, and it doesn't seem to want to find anything but the main building. So that one won't work in this situation. We could try select subject and see what happens. So this is another way you may want to select your building, but again, it's just finding the same thing that the object selection tool is doing. So Control Command D to deselect. I could freehand draw it with the lasso tool. So this takes a little bit of practice, but I could draw along like this to select certain areas. I wouldn't use it for this circumstance, but you might need to. So I just wanted to show you how to do it. And the final one is the pen tool, which is probably the most fiddly, but also the most accurate. So the pen tool looks like a little calligraphy nib. And I'm just going to zoom in a little and show you how the pen tool works. So you can just make little points. Whoops, and press Control or Command Z if you need to undo. And these little points will eventually turn into a selection. So it is a little fiddly. But the great thing about buildings is that they are usually straight. This one, not so much, but we don't have to select the building in this circumstance. Now, if you want to draw a straight line with the pen tool, so say I was selecting a side of a building, you could hold down Shift and it draws a straight line. And then you want your little points to meet up at the end. Then you would right-click inside and hit Make Selection. You can go with pretty much what's in here. Usually 0 is best for the feather radius, and hit OK. And now you've made a selection of a particular area. And so if I did want to affect the bits of this building separately, I could select the ground. I could select this section in here. I could select this little ribbon of bricks here. I could select the ground, the grass, and then I could select this part of the building. And I could even selectively affect different parts of this building. So it really depends how much effort you want to go to in your image. So now that we've got that selected, I am going to add a curves adjustment layer. And I might do that above everything that we've done already. And I'm just going to pull down the middle of that curves to darken that ground right up so it's no longer a distraction. So somewhere about there I think looks good. Next, I think the sky is too bright. So luckily that is already on its own layer. So I'm going to add a levels layer to affect that. And I can just highlight the layer mask by Control or Command clicking this sky layer from earlier. Then I can add my levels and it will pop that in as a mask. And then we can start to darken that sky for a bit more drama. Now I want to keep this building bright, but taper the light on the edges of the building out. So to do that, I'm going to add another curves layer. Again, I'm going to drag this down in the center. And now I'm going to load my gradient tool with G. It's this one here. And on the little options at the top here, I'm going to choose the one that's called reflected gradient, which is the fourth one along. Now I'll put my cursor in the middle of the image and drag it out to the sides. And basically I'm telling Photoshop that I want it to be bright in the middle and dark on the edges. So that's before and after of that. I actually think I'm going to take that out even more, maybe to about there, and perhaps even darken that up. But you can see how that looks in the layer mask. So it's gradually tapering out to the sides. Now I don't want this gradient affecting the sky. So what I'm going to do is Control or Command click back on that selection, jump out of this tool now, and then making sure this layer mask with the gradient is selected, I'll go to Edit, Fill, and then make sure that Contents Black is selected, and that's now stopped that from affecting the sky, as you'll see on the layer mask. So it's only affecting the edges of the building. So before and after. I also think I'm going to paint this away from the grass. So I don't want to do this too much. So I will use my brush tool, make sure that black is selected, and I'm going to change my opacity to about 50% because I don't want to fully remove it, just a little bit. And we'll paint away over that grass. I also find these little bits a little bit distracting. So I'm going to add another curves. And this time I'm not going to pull it down from the middle. I'm actually going to pull down the highlights. Yeah, that looks good. And I'm going to press Control or Command I to invert it. And I'm just this time going to paint it in using white. Just to darken down those edges a little. And I may even just paint that away from the bottom. I only want it affecting the building. So before and after. Now, one final thing I'm going to do, which I saw someone else do, and I really, really like it, is to add a lookup table. So if we go to our adjustment layer and we hit Color Lookup, and then where it says 3D LUT file, I'm going to choose the one that says Foggy Night. And it gives us this really kind of blue, matte black type of look. I'm going to change the blend mode of that, which is found under the word normal on your layers panel, to soft light. You could play with others if you like, but I like soft light. It's the most subtle. And then I'm going to bring down the opacity a bit to about 25%. Anyway, the rest is really just fiddling to taste. Now I just want to quickly walk you through one more image I created and the steps I used to achieve the final effect. This is the final image, and beforehand it looked like this. So just like before, I made a selection of the building and I dropped out all the distractions, including this little thing on the roof. I added in a different sky. Now, in this case, I've actually blurred the sky to make it look like it was a long exposure. So let's talk about how I did that. So this is the sky I used. And what I did is I went to Filter, Blur, and then Motion Blur. I used kind of a sidewaysy angle about that and then just brought my distance right up. So that's what it initially looked like. Brought that distance right up until it just really blurred the details out. And then I think I squashed it too. So let's show you that. I press Control or Command T once we hit OK on that. And just held down Shift and squashed it in like this. And so that's how we ended up with this guy here. Then I added a curves and I just darkened down that bit of the building on the side. Next, I added another curves to add a bit more punch just to the sky. Then I added a levels to really up the drama at the bottom of the image so it sort of forced the eye to go upwards. Then I worked on the building itself. So I actually carefully selected this little strip here and made one side of it black, darker, because again, I thought that was a bit distracting. Then I selectively darkened down this side of the building and only really the bottom. So I'll show you the layer mask. Bit of a mess, but it looked like that. Then I converted everything to black and white as I showed you earlier. Added that color lookup, the foggy night. This time it was quite high at 69% and I used multiply instead of soft light. And that gave it this really kind of cool noir look. And finally I added a levels just to give it even more drama. Now when positioning my sky, you'll notice that there's lightness at the top and darkness at the bottom now. And I did that so that it would match the way that the light was hitting the building. Now there are a few more distractions. So there's this little bit here and this really bright window, but I've kept them in because I kind of like those anomalies in the image. But up to you as to what you do. Again, totally personal taste. I don't get the chance to photograph much architecture, so I really enjoy this project and can see so much potential. It's one I'll be trying again for sure. If you also found it enlightening, be sure to give me a like as it helps out my channel, or subscribe for even more creative photography tutorials. Bye for now.